The morning of March 8, 1942, 9,000 feet above the French countryside, Flight Lieutenant James Pelly Fry adjusted his oxygen mask and peered through the curved perspex nose of his Douglas Boston bomber. Below him, the patchwork of occupied France spread out like a map he'd studied 100 times in the briefing room. The twin Wright Cyclone engines thrummed steadily, that particular sound, somewhere between a rumble and a hiss, that every Boston crew learned to trust their lives to. This was not supposed to work. The Luftwaffe had laughed when they first heard about these American light bombers arriving in Britain. German intelligence reports dismissed them as toys too small, too lightly armed, carrying a laughable bomb load compared to the mighty Lancasters and Sterlings. 4,000 pounds of bombs the Boston could carry. The Germans called it insufficient. Their fighter pilots joked about it in the mess halls. A light bomber attempting daylight raids over occupied Europe? It was suicide dressed up as strategy. And yet here was Pelly Fry, leading 12 Bostons toward the Matford Works at Poissy, just outside Paris. The factory that had once built civilian lorries now stamped out Wehrmacht transport trucks by the hundreds. Intelligence said the factory floor was running 3 shifts. Destroy it, they were told, and you cripple German logistics for months. The approach was everything they'd trained for cloud cover, holding until the last possible moment, then a swift descent to rooftop level. At 339 miles per hour, the Boston could outrun most Luftwaffe fighters if you caught them by surprise. The key was the surprise. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Pelly Fry's navigator, hunched in the nose compartment, called out landmarks through the intercom. The wireless operator behind them manned the single dorsal gun, scanning the sky for the Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s they all knew were up there. Somewhere. Waiting. Every Boston crew understood the arithmetic. 3 men, 1 inadequate defensive gun, against the most experienced fighter pilots in the world. The bombs were already armed. 24 500-pounders spread across 12 aircraft. Not the tonnage that shook cities, but precision instruments, if you could call them that, meant for a very specific kind of destruction. As they broke through the cloud layer, Pelly Fry saw it. The sprawling factory complex, its sawtooth roofs glinting in the weak morning light. Flak began immediately black puffs of 88mm shells that seemed to bloom like dark flowers around the formation. The Germans had been expecting them. Of course they had. Every daylight raid since 1940 became a calculated exchange, your aircraft and crews against their industrial capacity. But this raid on March 8th would prove something neither side had quite calculated. The Boston bombers, dismissed as inadequate, were about to demonstrate a capability that would force the Luftwaffe to reconsider everything they thought they knew about daylight bombing over occupied Europe. The question wasn't whether these American-built bombers could carry enough ordnance. The question was whether anyone had been asking the right question at all. Because while the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots were busy calculating bomb loads and defensive armament, they'd missed something fundamental about warfare itself, something that had nothing to do with tonnage, and everything to do with velocity, timing, and the peculiar advantages of being underestimated. In 60 seconds, those bombs would fall. And after they did, the myth of the Boston bomber as an inadequate weapon would begin its slow, irreversible death. To understand why the Luftwaffe laughed at the Boston bomber, you must first understand the doctrine that shaped their thinking. By early 1942, the air war over Europe had calcified into a set of seemingly immutable truths. The first truth: daylight bombing required heavy bombers. The Royal Air Force had learned this lesson in blood during the Battle of France. Their Fairy battles and Bristol Blenheim's light, fast, inadequately defended, had been slaughtered by German fighters. Entire squadrons were decimated in single missions. The RAF's solution had been to abandon daylight raids altogether, shifting to nighttime area bombing with 4-engine heavies like the Lancaster and Halifax. Darkness became their armour. The second truth: bomb tonnage determined effectiveness. German military planners calculated everything in terms of destructive capacity. The Lancaster could carry 14,000 pounds, the Flying Fortress could haul 12,000. These were the weapons that mattered. A light bomber carrying 4,000 pounds, barely more than a fighter bomber, seemed irrelevant to the strategic calculus of total war. The third truth: defended bombers required fighter escort to survive. By 1942, both sides understood this. American bomber advocates still clung to the fantasy that the B-17's 1350 caliber machine guns could fight off interceptors, but European skies were already proving them wrong. Without long-range fighter cover, even heavy bombers died in droves. Into this doctrinal landscape came the Douglas Boston. Originally designed for the French Armée de l'Air in 1938, it embodied an entirely different philosophy of air power, one that events had seemingly rendered obsolete before it ever reached production. The French had wanted a tactical attack aircraft, fast, nimble, capable of supporting ground forces with precision strikes. They'd ordered hundreds. Then, France fell. The incomplete orders were diverted to Britain, where they arrived at precisely the safe moment when light bomber doctrine appeared most thoroughly discredited. RAF test pilots at Boscombe Down flew the Boston and filed reports that praised its handling extremely pleasant to fly and maneuver. They wrote but questioned its utility. With a combat radius of just over 500 miles, it couldn't reach Germany from British bases. Its 4 machine guns couldn't deter determined fighter attacks. Its maximum speed of 340 miles per hour was fast for 1942, but not fast enough to guarantee escape from a Messerschmitt. The Luftwaffe's assessment was even more dismissive. Intelligence reports circulated among fighter wings described the Boston as unsuitable for strategic operations. Pilot briefings barely mentioned it. When Boston bombers began appearing over France in February of 1942, German fighter commanders didn't bother adjusting tactics. They'd shoot them down when encountered, certainly, but there was no need for special concern. Light bombers had proven vulnerable. This was settled doctrine. But doctrine, like all human certainty, rests on assumptions. And assumptions, once made invisible by repetition, become the unexamined foundations upon which entire strategies are built. The assumption the Luftwaffe made about the Boston wasn't wrong, exactly. It was incomplete. They'd calculated the bomber's offensive capacity 4,000 pounds of ordnance. They'd assessed its defensive armament inadequate. They'd measured its range insufficient for strategic bombing. All accurate observations. What they hadn't calculated was speed, not as raw velocity, but as tactical advantage. They hadn't considered altitude flexibility, the Boston's ability to operate effectively anywhere from 50 feet to 15,000. They hadn't factored in the psychological dimension of a bomber that didn't behave like a bomber was supposed to behave. Most critically, they hadn't imagined that the very inadequacy they'd identified might, in the hands of crews desperate enough and skilled enough, become a kind of asymmetric advantage. By mid-1942, RAF Boston squadrons were flying missions that shouldn't have worked. Over France, Belgium, and Holland, they struck targets in broad daylight using tactics that violated every lesson of the previous 3 years of war. They approached at wave-top height, climbed at the last moment, released their bombs, and vanished before German fighters could respond effectively. The Luftwaffe kept adjusting. The Bostons kept flying. And somewhere in that stubborn persistence, a question began to form, one that neither side had quite articulated yet, but which would reshape the entire nature of tactical air warfare in Europe. The crews who flew the Boston bombers were not supposed to be heroes. They were, in the careful language of RAF Bomber Command, expendable assets in a campaign whose strategic value remained perpetually unclear. Consider the mathematics they lived by. Each Boston squadron typically comprised 12 operational aircraft. Crew, 3 men per bomber pilot, navigator bombardier in the nose, wireless operator gunner in the rear, 36 men per mission. Life expectancy, by mid-1942, was measured not in months but in sorties. Losses ran between 15 and 20% on difficult missions. Simple arithmetic suggested that few crews would survive beyond their 10th operation. They understood this. The younger pilots, many barely 20 years old, developed a gallows humour about it. In the crew rooms at Swanton, Morley, and Alton and Great Massingham, they'd count the empty beds each morning after a mission. Another kit to pack, they'd say, the phrase becoming a kind of ritual acknowledgement of mortality's bookkeeping. But something in the nature of flying, the Boston produced a peculiar psychological effect. Unlike the heavy bomber crews who flew in vast formations, insulated by numbers and altitude, Boston crews operated in small groups at heights where you could see individual trees, where the Earth wasn't an abstract target but a rushing reality. The sensation of flying at 300 miles per hour just above French rooftops, close enough to see washing on lines, close enough to distinguish truck types in convoys, created an intimacy with the war that higher altitudes spared you from. Flight Sergeant Alan Chanter, who flew 27 operations with No. 88 Squadron, later described the unique feature of the Boston that symbolized this intimacy. The aircraft had a detachable control column in the rear compartment. The wireless operator could take over the ailerons and elevators, though not the rudder, to hold the plane straight and level if the pilot needed to bail out. It was, Chanter noted, the only RAF aircraft from which the captain was not expected to be the last man to abandon ship. This design detail, born from French specifications about crew survival, embedded a particular philosophy into the aircraft's very structure. The Boston was designed for a kind of warfare where survival depended not on armor or firepower, but on speed, timing, and the ability to make split-second decisions about when to stay and when to run. By July of 1942, when 6 American crews from the 15th Bombardment Squadron joined 6 RAF Boston crews for the Independence Day raid on Dutch airfields, the psychological profile of a Boston crew had crystallized. They were men who'd accepted certain mathematical realities about survival, but who'd also discovered that those same realities created a strange operational freedom. When you're flying an aircraft that doctrine says shouldn't work, in missions that shouldn't succeed, you develop a flexibility that more conventional operations couldn't accommodate. The Luftwaffe noticed. Intelligence reports from summer 1942 show the first signs of doctrinal confusion. Bomber formations that should have been easy targets were escaping. Daylight raids that should have resulted in heavy losses produced frustratingly modest German victory claims. Fighter pilots complained that the American bombers weren't following the expected patterns. They'd appear suddenly at low altitude, strike fast, and vanish before proper interception could be organized. More troubling still, the 4,000-pound bomb loads, dismissed as inadequate for strategic effect, were proving devastatingly effective against tactical targets. Railway marshalling yards, fuel depots, airfield facilities, these required precision, not tonnage. And precision was exactly what low-altitude, high-speed attacks delivered. By autumn of 1942, as Boston squadrons expanded and their missions multiplied across occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe found itself facing an opponent that had somehow turned inadequacy into doctrine. The bombers they'd laughed at were reshaping the tactical air war through sheer stubborn refusal to behave as inadequate weapons were supposed to behave. The question was no longer whether the Boston could work. The question was what it meant that it already was working and what that said about everything the Luftwaffe thought it understood about air warfare. No. 2 Squadron Group, RAF Bomber Command, operated the Boston with a specificity that bordered on obsession. Every detail mattered because the margins were so thin. The standard Boston 3 carried a crew weight allowance of exactly 540 pounds pilot, navigator, and gunner, plus their parachutes, Mae Wests, and survival gear. Flight rations consisted of chocolate bars, Horlicks tablets, and chewing gum to combat airsickness during low-level maneuvers. Each crew member carried a silk escape map sewn into their uniform lining and a small compass hidden in a tunic button. These weren't dramatic gestures. Over occupied France, you were 30 seconds from capture if you went down. The bomb bay configuration revealed the Boston's tactical philosophy. Unlike heavy bombers with their massive internal bays, the Boston used 2 smaller compartments, hydraulically operated, capable of carrying various combinations, 8 500-pound general-purpose bombs, or 4,000-pounders, or a mix depending on target requirements. The hydraulic system was temperamental crews, learned to manually crank the doors if the pressure failed, a process that took 90 seconds of frantic work, while flak burst around them. Wing Commander Pelly Fry's No. 88 Squadron, based at Alton in Norfolk, flew their operations with mathematical precision. Takeoff time, 0630 hours. Formation assembly over the North Sea at 5,000 feet. Descent to wavetop height often as low as 50 feet for the crossing to minimize radar detection. Then the climb for the bomb run, never higher than 9,000 feet, where German flak was most concentrated but fighter interception took precious seconds longer. The crews calculated everything in terms of seconds. At 340 miles per hour, you covered 500 feet per second. The gap between safety and catastrophe was literally the time it took to count to 3. Navigator Sergeant David Reichs, who flew with No. 18 Squadron, kept a detailed log of approach times. His notes, preserved in his personal effects, show the obsessive precision. Approached target 0742. Flak commenced 0743. Bombs away 0744. Clear of defences 0746. 4 minutes from relatively safe to relatively safe again, with 2 minutes of absolute vulnerability in between. The Luftwaffe adapted, but their adaptations revealed their continued misunderstanding. They positioned fighter patrols at medium altitude, 12 to 15,000 feet, where doctrine said bombers would appear. They concentrated flak batteries around targets, in predictable patterns based on previous heavy bomber approaches. They scheduled fighter readiness around the dawn and dusk periods when heavy bombers typically operated. Boston crews exploited every gap in this doctrinal thinking. They flew midday missions when Luftwaffe fighters were being refueled and rearmed. They approached from unexpected vectors over the North Sea instead of across the Channel, or along river valleys that flak commanders had deemed too difficult for bomber navigation. Most critically, they operated at altitudes that German doctrine had essentially written off as tactically insignificant. Flight Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, tail gunner with the American crews operating Bostons in July 1942, wrote to his family about the peculiar intimacy of low-level flight. "You see their faces sometimes, the German gunners. They're not ready. We're there and gone before they can track us properly. It's not about being brave. It's about being where they don't expect you to be." The psychological toll of this kind of flying was documented in RAF medical reports from late 1942. Boston crews showed higher rates of what doctors called operational fatigue than heavy bomber crews flying similar numbers of sorties. The constant low-level maneuvering, the sustained high-speed flight, the necessity of split-second timing all produced a particular kind of exhaustion that altitude and formation, flying partly insulated against. Yet loss rates for Boston squadrons, while significant, ran consistently below predictions. No. 88 Squadron lost 4 aircraft in their first 20 missions, 20%, high but sustainable. No. 226 Squadron's loss rate through summer 1942 averaged 16% per operation. These were not the catastrophic 30 to 40% losses that doctrine predicted for unescorted daylight bombers operating over defended territory. Something in the equation was wrong. Either the Boston was more capable than assessed, or the Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine was less effective than assumed, or most likely both sides were fighting with incomplete understanding of what actually determined success or failure in tactical air warfare. The evidence was accumulating in operational reports, loss statistics, and target assessment photographs. What it meant was about to become devastatingly clear. December 6, 1942. Operation Oyster. The Philips radio and valve works at Eindhoven, Netherlands, one of the most heavily defended industrial targets in occupied Europe. Wing Commander Pelli led a mixed force of 93 aircraft, 47 Lockheed Venturas, 36 Douglas Bostons, and 10 de Havilland Mosquitoes. The target lay 200 miles inland, ringed by flak batteries and within easy range of multiple Luftwaffe fighter stations. Everything about the mission violated conventional wisdom about daylight bombing in winter 1942. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 1300 hours broad daylight, maximum visibility, perfect conditions for defenders. German radar tracked them from the moment they left British airspace. Fighter commands at Schiphol, Deelen, and Gilze Regen scrambled interceptors. This was supposed to be a slaughter. The Bostons flew in the center of the formation, 6 squadrons in tight VIX of 3. At the Dutch coast, they dropped to 2,000 feet. Flak immediately erupted 88s, throwing up a curtain of explosive shells that turned the sky black with bursting fragments. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dove into the formation. What happened next appears in multiple German after-action reports with a consistency that suggests genuine confusion. Luftwaffe fighter ace Oberleutnant Hans-Georg Hackbarth, credited with 73 victories, filed this account. The American bombers did not maintain formation as expected. Individual aircraft broke from their groups at different altitudes and speeds, making coordinated attacks difficult. By the time we positioned for the second pass, they had already reached target area. The Bostons weren't maintaining formation because maintaining formation wasn't the point. Each squadron approached Eindhoven from slightly different altitudes and vectors, creating multiple separate streams that flak controllers couldn't track simultaneously. The lead squadron, number 88, descended to just above rooftop height for their final approach, rendering radar tracking useless and forcing flak gunners to depress their guns to dangerous angles. At 13:47, the first Bostons released their loads. 500-pound bombs with 11-second delay fuses crashed through the Phillips factory roof. The delay allowed the bombers to escape the blast radius, another tactical adaptation that heavy bomber doctrine didn't accommodate. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The bombing lasted 12 minutes. 36 Bostons dropped 144 bombs. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed 2 entire factory complexes destroyed, the radio valve works and the main assembly building. Production capacity was reduced by approximately 60%. The Dutch resistance later confirmed that minimal casualties occurred among forced labourers because the precision strikes hit manufacturing areas during a shift change. The cost: 4 Bostons lost, 9 Venturas, 1 Mosquito, 14 aircraft from a force of 93, a 15% loss rate. High, certainly. Unsustainable over extended periods, but not the 30 to 40% that Luftwaffe doctrine predicted for daylight raids against defended targets. More significantly, the target was destroyed, not damaged, not partially degraded, destroyed to the point where German authorities estimated 18 months would be needed for reconstruction. 18 months bought with 4,000 pounds of bombs per bomber, delivered by 3-man crews in aircraft the Luftwaffe had dismissed as tactically insignificant. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonnen, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace who observed the raid from Eindhoven, later wrote, "We had been told the light American bombers were nuisance weapons, incapable of strategic effect. On December 6th, we watched them eliminate one of our most important electronics production facilities in 12 minutes. Our intelligence assessments were not merely optimistic, they were fundamentally incorrect." The Luftwaffe Fighter Command issued new tactical directives within 48 hours of Operation Oyster. Low-altitude combat air patrols were extended, flak battery placements were reconfigured to cover previously ignored approach angles. Fighter pilot training incorporated scenarios specifically designed around fast, low-level bomber interception. In other words, they stopped laughing. The Boston bomber had forced a doctrinal revision through the simple expedient of continuing to exist and operate despite being, according to all established theory, inadequate to the task. The psychological shift this produced rippled through Luftwaffe tactical planning for the remainder of the war. But the real irony, the one that neither side fully grasped until much later, was still emerging. The numbers told a story that neither British planners nor German defenders had anticipated. By the end of 1942, RAF Boston squadrons had flown 1,214 operational sorties. They'd dropped 4,856,000 pounds of bombs, roughly 4,000 tons. Aircraft losses, 168. Crew casualties, 504 men killed, missing, or captured. Compare this to RAF heavy bomber operations over the same period. Lancaster and Halifax squadrons dropped approximately 157,000 tons, nearly 40 times the Boston's tonnage. But their loss rates averaged 4.1% per sortie across all operations, with individual missions frequently exceeding 10%. The mathematical trade-off seemed straightforward. Heavy bombers delivered overwhelming destructive capacity at the cost of proportionally higher casualties. Except the mathematics shifted when you calculated target effectiveness rather than raw tonnage. The Phillips works at Eindhoven remained inoperative for 14 months, not the 18 German authorities had estimated, but still a catastrophic degradation of production capacity. The cost: 4,000 tons of bombs total if you counted all ordnance dropped by all aircraft in Operation Oyster. A heavy bomber raid of equivalent effectiveness would have required at least 40 Lancaster sorties, roughly 240 tons, and would have caused extensive collateral damage to the surrounding city. The Matford works at Poissy, hit by 12 Bostons in March 1942, ceased truck production for 7 months. The railway marshalling yards at Abbeville, attacked repeatedly by Boston squadrons through autumn 1942, operated at reduced capacity until the following spring. Coastal batteries at Dieppe received such persistent attention from low-level Boston strikes that German commanders began positioning additional flak guns specifically to defend the defenders, a recursive logic that drained resources from other defensive positions. What was emerging, in the aggregated data of hundreds of missions, was a kind of warfare that existing doctrine hadn't quite conceptualized. Not strategic bombing aimed at breaking civilian morale, not tactical bombing in direct support of ground operations. Something between precision destruction of specific industrial and military targets using minimal ordnance delivered with maximum accuracy. Luftwaffe intelligence struggled to categorize it. Reports from early 1943 describe the Boston raids as persistent harassment operations of limited strategic significance. But the modifier kept shrinking as evidence accumulated. By mid-1943, assessment language had shifted to tactically significant precision strikes requiring increased defensive measures. The German fighter pilot Herbert Ehrfeld, who commanded Jagdgeschwader II and had 77 confirmed victories, wrote in his operational diary from February 1943, "The light American bombers force us to maintain constant readiness at altitudes and locations we previously considered secondary defensive priorities. This disperses our forces and complicates squadron-level coordination. We shoot them down when we can, but we cannot be everywhere they might appear." That phrase, "we cannot be everywhere they might appear," captured the essential problem. The Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine relied on concentrating overwhelming force at predicted points. Heavy bomber formations were predictable because they had to be. Altitude, speed, and formation integrity were their only defense. But Boston bombers operated with a flexibility that made prediction nearly impossible. They could attack at dawn or midday or dusk, at 50 feet or 9,000, alone or in groups of 3 or in squadron strength, against targets 200 miles inland or against coastal installations. The defensive resources required to counter this operational flexibility exceeded what any doctrine based on German experience in 1940 and 1941 had anticipated. By spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe had essentially conceded tactical air superiority over large portions of occupied Western Europe during daylight hours. Not because they lacked aircraft or pilots, though both were becoming scarcer, but because the nature of air warfare had shifted. Beneath them, while they'd been busy laughing at inadequate American light bombers, the 4,000 pounds of bombs that seemed so insignificant in isolation had become, through multiplication and persistence, a strategic weight that German industry could not sustain. The joke, it turned out, had been on those who'd been laughing. The crews who flew the Boston bombers paid for their effectiveness in a currency that statistics can only partially capture. Flight Lieutenant James Pelly Fry, who'd led that first raid on the Matford Works in March 1942, completed 47 operational sorties before being promoted to squadron commander. He survived the war but never flew again. Chronic inner ear damage from sustained low-altitude, high-speed flight had destroyed his equilibrium. He was 26 years old when they grounded him permanently. Sergeant David Reichs, the poet-navigator from No. 18 Squadron, died on April 21, 1945, 2 weeks before Germany's surrender. His Boston was hit by flak over northern Italy during an armed reconnaissance of the Po Valley. The aircraft burned for several days in the crater where it struck. Italian and German forces buried the wreckage with the crew still inside. Reich had written 17 poems during his service, most dealing with the subject of empty beds in crew quarters. His final piece, titled Let It Be Hushed, was discovered among his effects and dealt explicitly with drowning, a death he did not experience but clearly spent considerable time contemplating. Flight Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the American tail gunner, was killed on his 5th mission, the Independence Day raid on Dutch airfields in July 1942. He was 23. His aircraft was shot down by light flak at the Dutch coast. No parachutes were observed. Captain Charles Kagelman, who'd earned the Distinguished Service Cross during that same July 4th mission after attacking a flak tower with one engine destroyed and his wing on fire, survived European operations only to die in the Pacific Theatre in 1944 while commanding a B-25 group. He was 31. These weren't exceptional losses. They were typical. Of the approximately 3,000 RAF aircrew who flew Boston bombers operationally between 1942 and 1945, roughly 900 were killed in action or died of wounds. Another 600 were captured after being shot down. The mathematics of survival that crews had calculated in their heads, the empty beds, the kits to pack, proved grimly accurate, but the losses must be understood in context. Heavy bomber crews during the same period experienced casualty rates that exceeded 50%. RAF Bomber Command's overall casualties through the war reached 55,000 dead from a force of 125,000 aircrew. The American 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men. These were industrial-scale casualties inflicted on volunteers who'd understood, abstractly, that their chances were poor, but who couldn't truly comprehend what those numbers meant until they watched friends disappear mission after mission. Boston crews existed in a strange middle ground. Their losses were significant but not catastrophic. High enough that survival felt uncertain, but not so overwhelming that operational tempo collapsed under the weight of replacement needs. This produced a psychological effect documented in RAF medical records, what doctors termed sustained operational strain, as opposed to the acute breakdown more common in heavy bomber squadrons. They flew, they lost comrades, they kept flying. The missions continued because the missions worked. And they worked because someone, probably multiple someones across multiple planning committees, had looked at an inadequate aircraft with insufficient range and minimal defensive armament and decided that inadequacy might be repurposed into effectiveness if you simply changed what you were trying to do. The Luftwaffe never fully adapted to this shift. They continued to pour resources into defending against strategic heavy bomber raids, the 1,000-plane formations that blackened the sky and dropped incendiaries by the ton. They developed night fighters, improved radar, concentrated flak batteries around major cities, all necessary responses to a genuine threat. But while they focused on the dramatic, visible threat, the Boston squadrons continued their work. Precision strikes against railways, fuel depots, coastal batteries, airfields, small targets requiring small ordnance delivered with accuracy that heavy bombers couldn't match. By 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, tactical air superiority over France was so complete that Luftwaffe fighters rarely appeared over the invasion beaches. The Boston bombers hadn't achieved that alone, but they'd been part of a cumulative effort that proved more devastating than any single dramatic operation. By 1944, American doctrine had absorbed the lessons that British crews had written in blood over occupied Europe. The 9th Air Force, formed specifically for tactical operations in support of the ground campaign, operated on principles that Boston crews would have recognized immediately: medium-altitude strikes against specific targets, emphasis on speed and surprise rather than overwhelming force, acceptance of higher individual risk in exchange for greater operational flexibility. The Douglas A-26 Invader, which began replacing Boston bombers in late 1944, embodied these lessons in its design. Faster than the Boston 373 miles per hour maximum, better armed up to 14 50 caliber machine guns in some configurations. Similar bomb load, 4,000 pounds, but with improved accuracy through better bomb sights and targeting systems. The Invader would serve through Korea and into Vietnam, its operational philosophy tracing directly back to those early Boston raids over France. But the strategic significance extended beyond aircraft design. The Boston's operational record had demonstrated something that would reshape post-war air doctrine, that precision and persistence could achieve strategic effects without requiring strategic scale resources. This seems obvious in retrospect, in an era of guided missiles and drone strikes, but in 1942 it represented a fundamental challenge to established thinking. The Germans never fully internalized this lesson. Their focus remained on wonder weapons, jet fighters, ballistic missiles, revolutionary technologies that would somehow reverse their deteriorating strategic position through dramatic technical superiority. The Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter could fly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied aircraft. It was, by any measure, a stunning achievement. But Germany produced fewer than 1,500 of them, and chronic fuel shortages meant most never flew combat missions. Meanwhile, Douglas aircraft produced 7,478 Boston and Havoc variants. Not revolutionary, not even particularly impressive by heavy bomber standards. Just persistent, adequate tools wielded by crews who'd learned to make adequacy sufficient. This disparity between seeking transformative advantage and accepting incremental effectiveness runs through the entire strategic history of World War II. Germany invested enormous resources in developing the V-2 ballistic missile, firing over 3,000 of them at Allied targets. Each rocket cost approximately 100,000 Reichsmarks, roughly the cost of 4 Messerschmitt 109s. Total casualties inflicted, approximately 9,000 dead, mostly civilians. Strategic effect: minimal, perhaps even negative given the resources diverted from other military production. By contrast, the entire Boston bomber program development, production, training, operational costs represented a fraction of Germany's ballistic missile investment, and Boston squadrons contributed measurably to the destruction of German logistics networks, the degradation of industrial capacity, and the achievement of tactical air superiority that made the Normandy invasion possible. The Luftwaffe's dismissal of the Boston as inadequate wasn't irrational. It was based on accurate assessment of the aircraft's specifications compared to doctrinal requirements. What proved inadequate was the doctrine itself, the assumption that strategic effect required strategic means, that small weapons couldn't produce large results, that insufficient force was simply insufficient. By 1945, as Boston squadrons flew their final missions, mostly dropping surrender leaflets to isolated German troops in Italy, the aircraft had become almost invisible in the larger narrative of strategic bombing. Historians focused on the dramatic 1,000-bomber raids, the firestorms over Hamburg and Dresden, the atomic weapons that ended the Pacific War. These were the transformative technologies, the decisive moments that shaped how we remember the conflict. But wars are won in aggregate, through the accumulation of small advantages pressed relentlessly over time. The Boston bomber represented that kind of warfare, unglamorous, persistent, effective, not through overwhelming individual capability, but through consistent application of adequate force against vulnerable targets. The 4,000 pounds of bombs that had seemed so laughable in 1942 had, through multiplication and repetition, helped break the industrial capacity of occupied Europe. Not dramatically, not decisively in any single moment, but comprehensively, over time, in ways that German strategic planning had failed to anticipate or counter effectively. Return to that March morning in 1942, Flight Lieutenant Pelly Fry's formation approaching the Matford Works at Poissy. The Luftwaffe had laughed at these bombers. 4,000 pounds seemed inadequate. By April 21, 1945, when Sergeant Reichs died over Italy, RAF Boston squadrons had dropped approximately £47 million of bombs in daylight operations over occupied Europe, not the tonnage that made headlines, not the scale that destroyed cities, but precise, persistent, accumulated weight applied against targets where precision mattered more than mass. The Matford Works never returned to full production capacity. The Philips factory at Eindhoven took 14 months to partially restore. Dozens of railway yards, fuel depots, coastal batteries, and airfields experienced similar degradation. German logistics networks, already strained by Soviet offensives in the east and Allied interdiction in the Mediterranean, fractured further under this sustained pressure. None of this was decisive in isolation, but warfare is rarely decided by single decisive actions. It's decided by the cumulative exhaustion of your opponent's capacity to continue fighting. Every truck that couldn't be built at Matford was a truck that couldn't supply forward positions. Every delayed repair at Eindhoven was electronics that couldn't equip U-boats or radar stations. Every disrupted railway yard was supplies that arrived late or not at all. The Boston bombers' greatest achievement wasn't any single mission, however dramatic. It was the demonstration that warfare operates on principles more complex than simple calculations of force ratios and tonnage delivered. The aircraft the Luftwaffe dismissed as inadequate proved adequate to a task the Luftwaffe hadn't properly defined: the systematic degradation of tactical infrastructure through persistent precision attack. This lesson echoed through subsequent conflicts. In Korea, in Vietnam, in every limited war where overwhelming force couldn't be applied, the operational philosophy developed by Boston crews, speed, surprise, precision, persistence, became the template. Modern tactical aviation doctrine traces its lineage directly back to those desperate missions over occupied France, where crews in inadequate aircraft discovered that inadequacy was a negotiable concept if you changed the terms of negotiation. The human cost remains: 900 dead aircrew, hundreds more captured or wounded, young men like Rijkes and Eckenrode who died doing work that history would mostly forget. Their memorial isn't the dramatic story of strategic bombing. It's the quieter, harder story of adequate people doing adequate work under impossible circumstances, and somehow making it sufficient. The Luftwaffe stopped laughing not because they were proven catastrophically wrong, but because they were proven insufficiently right. Their assessment of the Boston's capabilities was accurate. Their assessment of what those capabilities could achieve was incomplete. In warfare, incomplete understanding kills just as thoroughly as technical inferiority. By war's end, the surviving Boston bombers were scrapped or sold to smaller air forces or converted to civilian use. A handful survive in museum static displays where visitors walk past without quite understanding what they're seeing. Not the glamorous Spitfire or the imposing Lancaster, just a medium-sized twin-engine bomber that looks, to modern eyes, entirely unremarkable, which is perhaps fitting. The Boston's legacy was precisely its ability to achieve remarkable results through unremarkable means. To take 4,000 pounds of bombs inadequate by heavy bomber standards, and through persistence and precision make inadequacy irrelevant. The Luftwaffe had laughed at the Boston bomber. They stopped laughing around December 6, 1942. By then, the joke was already over. The punchline was written in 47 million pounds of ordnance delivered where it mattered most. Not everywhere, but exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to arrive. Sometimes 4,000 pounds is sufficient. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest tactical advantage you'll ever receive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.